Okay, everybody, come on in, grab a virtual seat. Welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 298th, getting close to 300, being recorded on Thursday, July 7th, 2022 at noon U.S. Eastern Time. We've got Gavin back with another in his series on API stuff, and this one is planning and building my Developer Feud Quiz API, and we'll look forward to having Gavin start in just a moment. Before we do, let me just take a moment to point out those things you see at the bottom of the screen. If you want to tell people how to find the meetup, the URL is coldfusionmeetup.com. It's actually a meetup.com group. There are other ColdFusion groups. This one is called the ColdFusion Meetup, and that's an easy way to get to that URL, to get to that meeting information. And the meetings are all recorded, and the meeting you guys are, the URL you're looking at right now, if you're here, is the URL of the YouTube meeting that will be recorded as we're talking. So when we're done, if you wanted to give out that URL, you could. If you want to find the past meetings, I've got a page on that meetup site, and you can get to that with recordings, plural.coldfusionmeetup.com. And then if you're at all interested in presenting, we'd love to have you. There's, just so many topics on which people could speak, from introductory stuff to curious new stuff to challenges, troubleshooting, whatever. Anything related to CF is welcome. And you can learn more about what this is about at speak.coldfusionmeetup.com. So with that as the introduction, let's go ahead and turn it over to Gavin. Thanks again for coming on, and welcome.
Thanks for having me again, Charlie. I appreciate it. Just signed into the chat so I can say hi there too. Okay, so just so you know, this is a follow-up from a very, very old series I started a long time ago. And so that one was actually back in, I think you posted it October 2020. So I apologize for everyone who's waited this long for the rest of it, but that one was Building APIs with ColdFusion Part 1, Start Coding APIs Today. And so I basically took a legacy site and I started to sort of like add some ColdFusion, and then we talked about ways we used to do APIs and everything. And kind of at the end of it, everyone was like, the last couple of slides was like, so is this how you build APIs today? And I'm like, hell no, that's not how I do it anymore. And so basically the next one was meant to be part 2. And it's been crazy, COVID and everything else and other things. So it's finally here. And so basically, I'm building a new API the way I do it now with clients. So this is using, ColdBox and a lot of cool tools and everything else. And this is how we build APIs every day. And so I want to show that off. And so I'm going to be speaking at Adobe Developer Week. And as part of that, I'm basically doing a presentation on a Developer Feud game. So I'm making a family feud game for developers, and I'm building this quiz API. And at Adobe Developer Week, I'm going to be using Vue.js with a Quasar framework to actually, utilize this quiz API and basically make a little front end app to consume it and use it. And so that's where we're at. So who am I? A software consultant for order solutions. I work with ColdBox, CommandBox, Box every day, working with ColdFusion for like 24 years now, and JavaScript as well for a long time. I love learning, and I love sharing these lessons learned, and I want to get information out to a lot of people. I talk funny because I'm from New Zealand, but I do live in Bakersfield, California. I got a loving wife, lots of kids, countless critters, and you'll see me on Twitter at Pickin, and I'm also blogging quite a bit on ordersolutions.com. You might also see me on the CFML news edition of the Modernize or Die podcast. So we're there every week giving you the news of the community, not just order stuff or ColdBox stuff. We have a lot of other news there from different frameworks and conferences, inside and outside CFML, job opportunities, etc. So it's definitely a lot of great content. We try and share it, and it's pretty fun, relaxed. Join us on the YouTube channel, and we'll go from there. I also do a lot of videos for CFcast. So we actually take the VS Code hidden tip and trick of the week out of that podcast, and the ForgeBox module of the week out of that podcast, and release it there. But I also have series on there about ColdBox Zero to Hero and Publish Your First ForgeBox Package, and quite a few others. So a lot of content there. There's free and paid content, so go sign up, and you can get a lot of great content for free. And if you want to subscribe, you get a lot of amazing content for a great price. As I mentioned, I will be speaking at Adobe Developer Week. So it's going to be July 18th. Luis Mahano is going to be right before me about building APIs, and he'll do a really good job there. And then I'm going to be following up with this building SPA, Android, and Windows apps with Vue.js and ColdFusion APIs. So what we're talking about today is the basis for this. And Into the Box 2022, I'm going to be there. I'm actually doing a workshop, a full-day workshop on similar content. It'll be a slightly different version of sort of a quiz game, not a Family Feud style. It's a different one completely, but we're doing a workshop, and we're doing a lot of great sessions there. And Charlie's going to be speaking at the pre-conference week. So it's like Adobe Developer Week, but it's basically a whole full week of content before the conference. Then they have the conference itself. It's going to be great. Early bird prices just ran out, but you can still get some good pricing there. And again, my workshops, Vue.js Spire mobile app with REST APIs. Go check that out as well. Hope to see you guys there. And CF Summit, I've submitted some talks, so maybe I'll be speaking there. Otis is doing a workshop, a 2-day workshop after. And if you like this type of content, building APIs and talking about all the different modules and then building apps with Vue on top of it, we're doing a 2-day workshop after CF Summit. So it'll be the 5th and the 6th. And me and Luis Mahano are running that one. It's going to be pretty cool. So I'm looking forward to that. So hopefully we'll see you in Vegas or Houston or somewhere. Okay, so what is this app? So I love Family Feud. Our family watches Family Feud a lot. It's a lot of fun. And I've always wanted to build like a developer-based version of it, like we can have a war. You can see who likes tabs or spaces, which is the best JavaScript framework, who's using ColdFusion or Lucy. Maybe you like Sublime Text versus VS Code versus Home Site. What's the most popular things? There's a lot of cool stuff that we can sort of talk about and make something fun out of it. It's going to be a ColdBox REST API, so that's the way I'm building it. It's going to be running on Adobe ColdFusion, and we're going to be using a Vue.js front end using the Quasar framework to deploy to multiple platforms. So I love Quasar. It's a great framework. It's simple. It's got a lot of, sort of utility style CSS built into it. It's got great components that come out of the box, and it allows me to basically, work hot reloading locally using a Spire app, and then it can actually export to, basically out there. I can do a Spire app, I can do a PWA, a progressive web app, I can do Android apps, I can do iOS apps, I can do Mac OS apps, I can do Windows apps. It's pretty neat. They have a lot of awesome stuff, and you code once and you deploy to wherever you want to go. It really makes it simple, and I just love it. So I've been using it for quite a while now, and it's a great framework, and it's using Vue.js, and Vue.js is a great front-end framework. We use it a lot, and it just sort of matches up nicely with sort of the ColdFusion style. So that's the app we're building. So today, we're basically going to be talking about planning and building the Developer Feud Quiz API. So there's sort of 3 steps to building an API, 3 different approaches, sorry. Basically, there's sort of a code-first approach, and that's probably what most people do. So you jump in, start coding, you get so far, and then someone says, well, this doesn't really quite look right. Can we do this? And you refactor it a little bit, and, and so you sort of like, basically MVP style, throw something out there, and see what happens. And that's how most people code their APIs. And that's not a bad approach, but most people lean more towards an API first or a design first sort of approach. To be honest, the API first and design first is pretty similar, but the API first is more of our company is API first. APIs are a top level product, and everything is APIs, and it's our baby. And, and it's very much like we are centered around APIs. So a lot of the same stuff will go into the API first as design first, but the API first basically trumps that, where like everyone in the organization has to have tie-in and buy-in, and it's very much a organization-wide approach. Design first, it could be a small team or a big team. So, excuse me. So I lean more towards the design first. API first is nice, but they're pretty similar. So we're basically going to sort of take a design first approach to planning this out. If you want to find a little bit more about it, I found this one, this blog article was really interesting. And I'll share these links and share the slides at the end of the session so you guys can grab them. But it's pretty neat. It sort of describes a bit more, but how you should choose what's important to each, what's actually included in each. So I won't take too much time going over that. So planning the API. So before we build our API, we should do a little planning. And the reason why is because we want to have a greater chance of creating a well-designed, well-documented, and consistent API. Sometimes if you just jump in there and start coding, maybe you got a small team, you're probably going to have a very different endpoints. It's like I worked with a team that one of the people I work with, like they weren't even a coder, but sometimes they got on the code just to do a couple of little things, and they could tell who wrote something basically by just looking at the code. They knew exactly who wrote it because we were just so different. We're all trying to follow our best practices, but it doesn't mean that my best practice is your best practice. And so the consistency was just terrible, and it was always a nightmare for us to try and edit each other's code. And so it just wasn't consistent. And so when you're developing something, consistency is one point, but when you're building an API, you have to worry about people working on it, people consuming it inside your company, and then those outside your company. And so the key is here, we want to get a better experience for those developing the API as well as those consuming the API. So I think consistency with an API is even more important than just your normal code. So some keys to a good API, documentation. Internally, documentation is good, but I think externally, documentation is even more important. So we should really be, focusing on having a well-documented API, easy for those internally and externally to, use and consume our API. We want to make it easy for onboarding. We want to make it as easy as possible for someone to get up and running with the API. And again, you can look at this two ways. Developers working on it, but also people consuming it. We want to make sure it's easy to get up and running and start hitting the API and getting results. Don't make it too hard. That barrier to entry needs to be very low. Stability. Obviously, you want your code to be stable, but this is more about the API itself. So we want the API and how you access the API to be stable. And so versioning is very important when working with APIs. And it's sort of a good idea to think about versioning from the get-go. So that's something to be aware of. Most people build with versions in mind, and with ColdBox, we default to, let's just start V1 to start with. And if we need to, basically do something that's not backwards compatible, or, breaking the version, then we'll create a V2 for that function or the entire functionality. Ease of use. We want to make it really important that it's easy to use for everybody. If it's not easy to use, people won't want to use it, and maybe they'll misuse it. And encapsulation, we want to, basically abstract away what we have in our code. We want to just encapsulate the pieces that we need to make it easy for people to develop, use, consume, etc. So we want to, encapsulate and abstract. So that's sort of the keys to a good API. So I like to start with user stories. So I don't know if people have used user stories before or not, but I think this is a great sort of approach. A lot of times we think similarly to this, but sometimes it's kind of nice to go through this process and really help you design something. So the setup is something like this: and then you choose a persona. I want to do something. That's my need. I want to do this so that I can achieve this goal. So in my scenario, given this precondition, when actions and input, then I get results. So this is sort of the format. And so let's start thinking about this, okay? So with this Developer Feud, for those who haven't seen the show, Family Feud, basically what they do is they have a bunch of questions, and they'll go out there and survey a bunch of people. So the host or the research companies will go out and ask a question. The question will be, tabs or, what do you think is better, tabs or spaces? Or what's your favorite IDE editor? That's your question, right? So one user story might be, as an admin, I want to get a list of questions so that I can display a list of questions to manage. So for in my app, I want to be able to display the list of questions so we can add answers to them or add votes for those answers, because in the surveys, they vote on an answer. So scenario, given I'm authorized with an API key with admin permissions, when I select search criteria, when I select search criteria, page and max rows, Then the API will return a paginated list of questions for those criteria. So that's a user story, right? That's one of the functions that, one of the processes that my API needs to support. Let's look at another one here. As an admin, I want to create a new question so that I can use the question in the quiz game. Scenario, given I'm authorized with the API key and admin permissions, when I provide information for the new question, then the API saves the new question and returns a struct representation of my question. Okay, so that's another user story. Also, we may want to throw in some user stories that have not happy endings. Like a lot of times we think about what are the actions that this API needs to handle, but what about this? As an admin, I want to create a new question so that I can use the question in my quiz game. The scenario is I am authorized with an API key with admin permissions. When I provide invalid information for the new question, say maybe I'm missing something that's required, or I have a text instead of an ID for something, then the API should return a 400 validation error. That's something that my system needs to be aware of. I need to understand, there's validation required or whatnot. So these user stories can handle those types of things too. So we have an option here for a user. As a user, I want to create a new question so that I can use the question in a quiz game. The scenario is I'm authorized with an API key with user permissions. When I provide information for the new question, then the API gives me an authorization error because only admins can add new questions. So hopefully you guys get the hint of that. Anyone in the chat, you guys use, user stories? Is that something you guys do? So let's look here. As an admin, I want to get details of a question so that I can edit a question. Given I'm authorized with an API key with admin permissions, when I select the question ID, then the API returns a struct representation of that question. We can also update a question. Maybe I want to get a list. So as an admin, I want to get a list of answers for a question so that I can display a list of answers to manage for a question. Given I'm authorized with an API key with an admin permissions, when I select the search criteria of the page and max rows, the API returns a paginated list of answers. It should be. Let me fix that. Sorry about that. Yes. Sorry. I'll forget to go back if I don't do it now. Cool. So William said he likes this format for user stories. Yeah, I really do too, William. There's probably a few different types out there, but you'll see later why I like this even more. So, but yeah, I don't want to spoil it. So spoilers. So here we got another one about creating a new question, a new answer for a question. And so sort of you get the idea, right? Like this is a format which is hopefully makes sense. And you're really planning, what is your app going to do? What is your API going to do? And so once we're done with user stories, then the cool thing is this information that we've gathered, the research we're doing, the planning we're doing here allows us to proceed with our design. So again, I've got quite a lot here. Well, let me just touch on this one real quick. So we talked about updating an answer for a question, deleting an answer for a question. And right here we have another one. As a user, I want to add a vote for my answer for a question. So we have questions have answers, and answers have votes. So by going through these user stories, we've actually helped sort of decide a few things. So these user stories told us something, right? We had to identify personas or people, actors that are going to be working on our API. So we need to be able to account for that. They talked about resources. Resources are the things we're acting on. Actions, what type of actions will these personas be doing on an action? And also we talked a little bit about inputs and a little bit about outputs, but we didn't go into too much detail, which we can do later. Personas act on resources with actions, providing those inputs and then receiving outputs. And so that's sort of the key with those user stories, is trying to identify these things. Because if we know that up front, it'll make our code easier to design, implement, and then we can review and refactor. So personas are those nouns, right? Those are the people, or the sometimes it's not a person, it's a system. So a good example now is we talked about admins and users. Okay, so admins are the ones creating things and adding and editing, where users are more viewing the questions, because users can get, maybe if they have a question that someone is asking, they'll see the answers for that question. You've broken down Stack Overflow in these few slides. Very good approach. Thanks, Joseph. So yeah, so personas are those nouns, and so it's admins or users, and then they work on those resources, right? They act on those, and so resources are usually the nouns. So we talked about questions, we talked about answers, we talked about votes. So those are the things that we're going to be working on. So those admins and users are going to be taking actions on these questions, answers, and votes. And so these individual resources make up what they call a collection. So we'll have a collection of questions, we'll have a collection of answers, we'll have a collection of votes, and each individual one is, basically a resource. So actions. So actions are those verbs, right? So you may want to list questions, or you may want to list answers, or list votes, or you may want to show a question or show an answer. You may want to create one or update one or delete one, right? So a lot of times we think of this as CRUD, create, update, or create, read, update, delete. But those are the verbs, those are the actions that people are taking on. So when you have a user story, look for those actions, because those verbs help you identify what you're going to be actually doing in your API. Now, question, which verbs do you use? As we mentioned, CRUD is create, read, update, delete. I know a lot of people use read or show or get, but if you're getting something, what about lists? Can you get a list? Or you just want to get all, find, search? There might be some different ones there. If you're creating, are you creating, or are you doing a new, or are you doing a save, or is a save, update, edit? You deleting stuff, you destroying stuff, are you, there's lots of different ways to describe that. And again, we were talking about consistency before. So consistency is important. We need to be thinking about that. So I know that some people like using new. Some people like using create or add. I didn't even put add in here. Oh my gosh. So that's one of those things where, different developers might use different verbs. And then if you're trying to call code and the code isn't working because it's not consistent, or if you've got verbs and other people are supposed to be doing it, consuming it, we got to make it easier for them, right? Okay, so once we've got that, now we can sort of start planning to build our URLs. Okay, so how do we create our URL? Should everything be top level collection? Should you have, API v1 / questions, API v1 / answers? Or should we do questions / answers? So answers belong to a question, like we talked about. So sometimes you want them all at the top level. Sometimes you want to use sub collections. So what should we do? What format should we be using for passing in those resource IDs? So a question ID or an answer ID. Do we want to put it in the path? Do we pass it as a URL parameter like we used to do all the time? Do you pass it in a header? Some people like headers for stuff because it's easy to log all that. So there's lots of different ways to do that. And then which HTTP verb should we use? In ColdFusion, we're used to using gets and posts. And that's what the browser, natively supports. So we use those a lot. But what about other HTTP verbs? There's put and patch and delete. What about those? Should we use those or not? And if we do, how do you use those in ColdFusion? So that's a good question to ask too. If you're consuming from like JavaScript, maybe using Axios. And Axios allows you to use those different verbs and stuff. But if you're just using HTML and you're posting a form, you can post a form, or you could, have a button or a link, use a get, but you can't use put and patch and delete. So how would you do that? So these are things we need to be thinking about, right? So what I like to do and the way we build things is we'd like to use versioning to create that stability that we talked about. So our URLs are usually going to start with the API, because your app may have other sections to it, right? But if it's just an API, maybe you're doing api.mysite.com. You don't need the API in front of it. You can just do v1. But a lot of times you're doing myapp.com /API /v1. So then we want to look at collections as top-level routes. So for questions, we could probably have API/v1/questions, and that'll get a list of questions. If we post to API v1 questions, then that should create a new question, right? Get and post. And then if you want to show a question, you could do API v1 questions and then question mark question ID equals. But we have pretty URLs these days, so why not use them? So we could actually put the question inside the path, and then ColdFusion can read that. We could use that. It's much more user-friendly, much more readable. And then when we use that, we can do things like getting a list of answers for a question. I got to edit this page too. Sorry, everybody. Answers for a question. My bad. Been a crazy week. I should have reviewed this a little better. Sorry. So there. So we can do something where we have the collection is questions, and then under a question ID, we could have a sub collection of answers. So those answers are related directly to the question. You don't have to worry about passing a question ID in the as a query param or in the header. It's in the URL, and that makes it really easy to see. And we're building that up. And so this is sort of like the RESTful approach. We're using resources and this formatting. And if you look at the RESTful-API.net, they have resource naming, notes and everything. So the things we're talking about today, we're trying to use best practices from a lot of different places. Auto Solutions really likes to look at what other languages are doing, look at other tools that are out there, looking at other, other best practices, because best practices are better if more people use them, they have input. If someone just says this is the way, we're not all Mandalorians, and basically it might not be the best, right? So we got to learn from other people. And so the things that I'm showing you and telling you about, we've learned from resources like that. Okay, so now we have URLs. So now we need to think about mapping those routes or URLs to handlers. So we have our HTTP verb and our URL. So how do we map it? Okay, William, about using CFCs for APIs. Yeah, we'll be getting to that here soon. So in my last presentation about APIs, Charlie sent the link in there, and I'll post it again right now. But basically, that was sort of the old school way to build APIs. I showed you how to use CFCs and use all different ways to do it, and that was sort of more the legacy way. And at the end of that, I basically said, I asked myself a question: is this how I build APIs today? And I said, hell no. There's a lot better ways to do it. There's a lot better resources, a lot better tools. And so this talk is more, how I'm planning and how I build APIs today. So yeah, you would be using a CFC in here, but we're talking about some ColdBox stuff in here. So ColdBox handlers essentially are CFCs. So it's like a controller or a handler. But yeah, so that's what I say when I say handler. It's a CFC, it's kind of like a controller, but ColdBox version. So yeah, so these are some questions. Again, I try to figure out like what type of questions should we ask when we design this. So do we put everything in that question CFC handler? What do we call the actions? So if you want to get a list of questions, do you call it question list questions, or just list? If you're adding a question, do you say add question, create question, save question, or is it question add, question save? Answers the same. Do you add an answer? Is that in the same handler? If you're voting for an answer, do you say vote for answer, or do you say vote? Or, if you're adding vote, deleting vote, editing vote. Yeah, so there's a lot of different things in here, a lot of different ways to put it in here. And so again, consistency, how do we know the best way to, to do that? Like, how are we going to make it easy for our developers to know what the actions are called? How do we know the best way to make it for the consumer to actually consume it? So, okay, and I saw just a couple more questions. Yeah, Charlie's saying, what's not to say someone shouldn't build normal CF to build APIs today. You're right. Like, there's a million ways to do it. And last time I showed a lot of different ways, and I didn't even show the Adobe ColdFusion way to do it. And like Lucy has built in, and then Adobe has built in ways. There's Taffy as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to build APIs. this is the way I build it. These are the tools I use, and this is what we've built up as Audis, working for lots of clients, building big and small APIs. And so that's really the goal of this one, is show you how I go about planning that and building it.
Front door.
By the way, I didn't say shouldn't. I said couldn't. Someone might say you shouldn't use the built-in ways, but I was just saying one could use the built-in. And you ColdBox and Taffy add capabilities, and so people should definitely consider them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said, there's always pros and cons, and that's a big thing. And me sharing this information gives you some of the reasons why I use ColdBox, the way I build these APIs.
By the way, before we go any further, since it got brought up by William, I was making some adjustments and notes of things, so I didn't catch what you said that led him to say that. Is there something here you're talking about right now that could not be done with the CF built-in REST capability or Taffy, or is it something that you were just talking about how it's easier given the way ColdBox works?
Well, I mean, there's a few things I'm going to show you, which I'm pretty sure Taffy doesn't do. ColdBox built-in stuff, there's certain things it does, and again, I haven't used them. They've improved them over time. The original implementations weren't as good. They've improved. So, I've used what I've had experience with. But I'm talking about when he says about using CFCs for APIs, I think of the old, I'm going to hit my CFCs folder / questions.cfc and then pass in the question.
So you're not even talking about the REST approach.
Yeah, because people can build APIs that way. And
right.
Yeah, I mean, you can build them the old school way, and that last presentation I even showed that, and that's how I first built my first APIs. And to be honest,
I don't remember because it was in 2020. Yeah, you just said a couple minutes ago that in that talk in 2020, you don't think you showed using the ColdFusion built-in REST capability.
No, I didn't even
as an API for, or as a way to implement APIs. So let's just leave it at that to say folks should know that there are multiple ways to build APIs. And now Jason's brought up the API manager, and this is where I think it's time for another API talk to clarify.
I think Developer Week they're going to be talking about that.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to clarify though is that the API manager is a way to manage the serving of APIs, however one serves them. So one could use the API manager as a top, as a front end, as it were, a proxy, as it were, to ColdBox APIs, or to the ColdFusion REST APIs, or to Taffy APIs, or to some other APIs that you serve through some other tool that has nothing to do with ColdFusion. So the API manager is more of a gateway. So it's a totally different subject.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's plenty of different ways to do it and whatever. And so, this talk was basically showing more of those tools and sort of the, like if you just wanted to add a little bit API to your legacy app, that last talk gave you different ways, and it talked about some of the things that you want to think about. And so it was sort of an evolution of APIs. And then today we're talking more about how we do it with ColdBox. And even to be honest, in this, like there's a few mentions of ColdBox, but a lot of it is just planning and building an API regardless of the framework.
Exactly.
So I'm going to show you a few things that I do, but I'm going to show you examples where we look at Rails, Ruby on Rails for some inspiration and stuff. And so,
by the way, one other thing that Jason said was that Adobe makes the API manager available only in ColdFusion Enterprise. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. How does the community encourage small developers to latch on if that's the case? When you say how does the community encourage small developers latch on to what, Jason, specifically? And then you added, okay, thanks, looking forward to the ColdBox Gateway presentation. So I might have missed that. Did you say, Gavin, that coming up will be somebody somewhere giving?
No. So what I meant is in the Adobe Developer Week, there are people talking about building APIs in ColdFusion and using the ColdFusion REST, I believe. Right. The API manager is definitely different. So ColdBox doesn't have a gateway. You could use the API manager in front of ColdBox, but you can also use it in front of
anything,
a JavaScript API as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ruby,
a lot of different tools. And you're right, the enterprise version does have the API manager, but you don't need the API manager. But if you are enterprise level apps, you probably have the enterprise version of ColdFusion. And if you're getting enough traffic, the API manager gives you some cool tools to be able to help with your big traffic. So you don't need the API manager to make an API in Adobe ColdFusion. It gives you a little more options. You've got some benefits. And again, I don't use it very much, but you can control more endpoints if you have the enterprise version versus standard. And but so my answer to that is, if you want to learn more about the built-in REST API stuff for ColdFusion, there's a few sessions out there from previous summits, I believe, that are online in developer weeks, and they should be having one coming up. But yeah, so this one, again, we're doing more planning and sort of giving some of the tools that we use included. But anyways, there's lots of cool stuff. Hopefully you guys find it valuable, whether you use Coldbox or not. But there's a lot of people moving towards Coldbox. The most popular workshop we're getting lately is people wanting to learn REST APIs, because APIs are a big part of development these days. So,
and just to wrap up that point, isn't it also possible that Coldbox adds in its built-in functionality some things that somebody would have to use the API manager to add the capabilities to a traditional ColdFusion REST API? Like you add versioning, don't you? And you might add security, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, we add versioning, we have caching, different ways to do caching involved. We have route visualizers, and we'll talk about that soon too. So you have a little module that actually reads the Coldbox routes and then generates a little tool to see it. We've got tools for visualizing your documentation. There's a lot of cool stuff out there, but there's other stuff outside of Coldbox and outside of ColdFusion that you could use too. So
cool.
But yeah. So anyway, let's. No problem. Like I said, Jason, that's what chat's for. That's what these live webinars are for. If you wanted to watch a pre-recorded thing, you could. But the questions, sometimes it's clarification. And again, I'm not an expert on Taffy. I've read the book that Adam Tuttle put out. I've looked at Taffy and used it for small projects, and compared and contrasted. But there's things that we do because it was missing from Taffy, or we thought we could do something different or easier, and same from the ColdFusion REST API. We hit pain points, and so we build tools. That's kind of the way developers work, and so that's what we've done at Audis. So some of the things we're building and showing you is because of pain points. Okay, so we were talking about mapping routes and URLs to handlers, and so basically it comes down to consistency here. So let's look at how we can, sort of make this more consistent. Let me click on the right thing. So a goal for me is to have clean and maintainable handlers. I don't want to have handlers or CFCs that are huge, right? I don't want to have 3,000 line handlers. I don't want to have big CFCs with just tons of code. Uncle Bob's book, Clean Code, encourages smaller components. It talks about components should do one thing and one thing well, and a function should do one thing and one thing well. And the whole KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. Try and keep things really simple, really obvious, easy for people to, when developing or consuming, because we're talking about both today, you want to make it simple and easy for people to assume, like that they could just assume things, those conventions. That's one thing, like Coldbox is convention based, is we want to make it obvious. We want to make it easy for somebody to pick something up and follow along without having to learn this new system. I don't want to know if Bob wrote this or Jeff wrote this. It should be the same, so that way our team can work more efficiently. And then, the whole single responsibility principle, keep things that change together, and don't have one thing doing a million different things. And so one thing that people sort of forget, though, sometimes is if handlers and controllers get too big, you don't have to match a resource in the database record one-to-one. So sometimes people actually have it where, like basically if we have a database table for questions and a database table for answers and a database table for votes, that you make one handler for each one of them. And that's not a bad method, to be honest, but it doesn't mean you have to. And I'll give you some examples later about how you may want to break it down even more. For example, users. Okay, users are in your system everywhere, but what if you want an active user? So do you want to have a user and then have to activate them or deactivate them, or you're going to log them in or not log them in? So instead of having a user controller that's going to have a million things like logging someone in, logging someone out, resetting passwords or whatever, you may actually want to break your handlers up a little bit more. And you may have an active users, basically an active users handler, or an inactive users handler, or maybe you want to have a session handler. So the session helps you create and destroy sessions because it's a user doing something, and that user and that action together is actually something you want to look at. And that leads me to the CRUDDY by design. I used to have, some pretty decent API code, I thought, until I watched this talk by Adam Watham at LaraCon US 2017. It's PHP, it's Laravel. PHP, some people might just I don't want to touch PHP. You don't have to touch it. The ideas in this talk are transferable. And Laravel, to be honest, Laravel is an amazing, framework. And a lot of things that Otis brings to this community is stuff we've learned from Laravel. There's a lot of amazing things that they build. And Eric Peterson, he watches Laravel stuff all the time. He's always trying to look for new ideas, quick QB, database migrations. A lot of stuff that he's introduced to ColdFusion over the years has been from something similar in Laravel. And so anyway, this CRUDDY by design talks about how your CFC handler or your controller should really only have 7 standard REST or CRUD actions. If it has more than that, you're doing it, well, we want to say wrong. You're not doing it the best way. If you can try and follow this rule, or a convention, it's a good way to force yourself to keep your controllers, slim. Don't become too bloated. Follow those things we talked about a minute ago about, smaller components that do one thing well, keeping it simple, single responsibility, like those things all tie in. And so it's a great way to do that. And you can often lead to learning interesting things about your domain. So as you use that, you'll learn that, I have users, but instead of having an authorization handler, it's a better one to have as maybe a session handler, because the session is the resource. When a user logs in, we are creating a session. When they log out, we are deleting a session. We're removing the session. So instead of having a user handler and it has a login and log out function, the URLs can still be login and log out. Don't get me wrong, but under the covers, it can map to a session dot create and a session dot destroy or delete. So I really liked it. And that leads into this whole resourceful routes. And so we actually looked at Ruby on Rails. And so if I have that over here, I think I can pull it in. So Ruby on Rails has this thing. We're doing something over and over and over and over again, right? For every single resource in an API, and you're building CRUD, they keep creating all these different routes. So, and again, we talked about new or create or, all these different sort of names. And so this is sort of like the resourceful routes that they've decided for, say, a photo. So if you want to get a list of photos, you should hit /photos with a get. If this is for an like a ColdFusion backend app, you may also want to return an HTML form for creating a new one. So that would be /photos/new. And when they click the submit button, it would actually post to /photos to create a new photo. So in an API, we don't use this one because we're not building a form, and we don't use this one because we're not providing an editing form. But all the rest of them are API endpoints. So if you want to create a new photo, you post to /photos, and that is the photos handler, the create action. If you're going to display a specific photo, you're going to get to photos/ and then the ID, and that's going to be photos.show. And then if you're going to update a specific photo, you patch or put to /photos/ID, which is photos.update, and you delete the photos to the ID, and then photos.destroy. And now ColdBox, we basically looked at 3 or 4 different frameworks, different systems out there, and we do pretty much everything the same, except for we do not use destroy. We think delete sounds better. So that basically our stuff, our resourceful routes in ColdBox, which you can find more information at this link, basically use the same conventions. And so there's some cool little things that gives us, but consistency is key. Using conventions is great because as a developer, I don't need to worry about naming things. And naming things is one of the 3 hardest things in programming. I'm sure how many hours we've all wasted trying to name something, right? Now I don't need to think about it. I may not agree with this, but if everybody else does it, I'm going to use it. So resourceful routes. Okay, so now that we've looked at resourceful routes, we probably want to confirm our routing design decisions. Okay, so let's look at the format we're using for URLs. So if I'm wanting to, get a list of questions, I want to get to API v1 questions. Sounds good. So if I want to create a new question, do I hit API v1 question/new or question/create? No, I want to post it to API v1 questions. Okay, that's using the verbs, that's using that resourceful routes. If I want to create a new one, I'm going to post to the resource collection. Okay, so then next up, we also want to get an individual question. So if we're going to get API v1 questions, we're going to use the question ID. If we want to update, we do a put to the same thing because we have the question. We know what question it is. We want to either get it or update it. So we put. If we want to delete it, we have the same URL and we just send the delete. So it's pretty convenient. So now what we have to do is we have to map those API endpoints to the right handler. So we want to map to the questions handler and then map to the appropriate actions. So if we look at the CRUDDY by design stuff, if we go to get API v1 questions, we should do questions.index. If we want to post a new question, that post to API v1 questions goes to questions.create. If we want to get an individual question, we do get to API v1 questions, question ID, and we use questions.show. So some people might want to do get or anything else. Follow the conventions. Life will be easier. Stop making decisions about what I should call it. Everybody knows show is the way to do it. What about updating a question? Well, we put the same thing, API v1 questions, question ID, but now questions.update is what's called. So these verbs, right? These verbs do different things. So behind the scenes, your router will point things to the right place. And so we'll do that with our ColdBox router, but other frameworks have other routers. You can do the same thing there too. So delete a question, delete goes to questions.delete. Okay, but let's look about sub-collections. What about answers? So answers, we want to map something to the answer handler with the appropriate action. So if we want to get a list of answers, we go API v1 questions, question ID, answers, and that goes to answers.index. We want to create a new question, or we want to post to the collection of answers. So we go API v1 questions, question ID, answers, and answer.create. If we want to get an individual question, we hit the API v1 questions, question ID, answers, answer ID. That is that answer, and I'm either going to show it, I'm going to update it, I'm going to delete it. And using the right verbs, it knows how to do it. Now, like I said, we may not agree with all the terms, but over time, you'll forget about that. And anyone who uses JavaScript and uses something like Prettier, you may have really strong opinions on formatting, but at the same time, it's nice to have a consistent format that everybody uses, and Prettier does that for you. You basically code and just save, and it formats it for you. This one here, you just create your handlers the right way, and it just works. So we have to add these routes now, right? So ColdBox routes look like this. It's pretty similar to some other languages. Again, we followed conventions from other languages and other frameworks. And so this is the way you do it. So routes are more specific first to least specific. So you always have to put the question ID above the questions. If this was above it, then the questions would catch it all the time, and it would ignore anything after the questions. So we put the more specific first. So in here we have the route is questions, question ID, and you're probably like, wait, what happened to the API v1? The cool thing is, if I'm in ColdBox and I'm adding these routes to the API v1 module, it automatically puts the API v1 in front of it. So these are just specific to this version. So when I create version 2, I can create, basically copy this route file over, and now all those routes are API v2 automatically. So that makes my life easier. Modular design helps with things like that. If your framework doesn't do that, you might have to put the API v1 in here too. But so questions, question ID, and so I'm going to handle it with this handler, my questions handler, and then I'm going to send it to this action. So if it's a get, I'm going to send it to the show action. If it's a put, I'm going to send it to the update action. If it's a delete, I'm going to send it to the delete action. So if we get questions, question ID, it's going to go questions.show. If I'm going to put, it's going to do questions.update. And that's how the router works. So if I go to questions here, so just / questions, it's going to use the question handler. And if it's a get, it's going to go to the index to give me a list. If I'm going to use a post, it's going to go questions.create. So that's how our routes work. So not too many lines, but we've got all that power. And our URLs are nice and pretty. They make sense. They're readable. They're understandable. They're assumable. And they should be consistent from one resource to another. So we got a lot of the checkboxes there on our, what makes something important. How can we make this even easier? Well, since we're using resourceful routes, ColdBox says, hey, if you're following conventions, we can help you here. So what it does is if you use this little tool, you can say API resources in your router file and just say questions. It's going to generate those routes for you. Now, it does assume that you're using ID for all of your keys. And so if you do API resources questions, it's going to spit out basically this routes, but instead of question ID, it's going to say ID. I don't like that. I like to have question ID in there. So if I prefer something like question ID, I can add the parameter name as a named parameter here. So I can say my resource is questions and my parameter name is question ID. Now, you may see API resources, but these are resourceful routes. If I take the API off, it'll create all of the conventions here. So it'll create the index, new, create, show, edit, update, and or delete for us. It'll show all of those actions. If I do API resources, it doesn't have those two routes for the HTML forms. So API resources makes your life a little easier, and it'll basically generate that for you. So it'll generate this little line right here will basically generate this code, right here. So it generates it for you. So instead of having to write that for every single resource, ColdBox allows you just to say API resources. Resource equals questions, parameter name equals question ID. And if you have another endpoint or resource, you can do the same thing. And there are more parameters in here too. The documentation allows you to tell it that this one belongs in a certain module, or if you have name spacing or other stuff, you can give it more specific details. But this works, and it's great. And then, of course, again, we do things over and over again, right? If we're creating this, we're following conventions, I'm creating a handler for questions. I'm going to create a handler for answers. I'm going to create a handler for votes. I'm going to have the same index, the same show, the same create, update, etc. That's a lot of work to create all those files, put them in the right place, name them the right way. Well, CommandBox has a lot of great scaffolding built in. And so if you're in CommandBox, you can just say ColdBox create resource and then pass the name questions. And then if you need to pass a parameter name, you say question ID and you push enter, and it's going to spit out all the files that you need. It's going to stub out all your handlers, actions, and everything else. It's going to create tests and everything for you too. So it'll actually spit out a whole bunch of stuff for you, so you don't have to do that. Again, that's just something that ColdBox does with CommandBox resources. Like, we just try to make this easier, right? We do something over and over and over again. We're usually looking for a way to improve it, make it easier, make it better. So that's something we do. Okay, well, how can I see the routes that it's creating? Because you don't actually see them in your router code. So we built a tool, ColdBox Route Visualizer. So if you go to your browser and type Route Visualizer on the end of it after you've installed it from ForgeBox, then it'll read your ColdBox routes, it'll read your modules, and it'll spit out something like this. And if I think I have it here somewhere, let me look for the, well, actually, I think it's in here. I got to escape. Here. This is my REST API. If I go to my route visualizer, you can come in here and you can see, look, I've got, all these modules get loaded. So I've got CB Swagger and CB Swagger UI. So these are the routes that all these modules are adding. But I can also come in here and say, look, API v1. So this is a module. Inside this module, I can open that module's router. So in here, if you go to / it goes to echo to index. And then we had a few from the REST template. So it has login, log out, register, etc. But here's the question. So if you hit / questions, you'll see the handler is questions, and you got an action of get goes to index, post goes to create. And then you got questions, question ID, and that's put goes to update, delete goes to delete, get goes to show. So it made that for us. I can even run it. If I want to run something, I can run it from here. There's all sorts of cool stuff. And if I pull up the code real quick, now we're getting to that point. But if I come in here to my ColdBox app, my API, and I go to modules, V1, and look at my router, you can see those are the routes. That's what it spits out. And then we've got other routes here. But you can also do gets and posts. ColdBox tries to make that easy. But I can just replace that pretty simply with some resourceful routes. Okay, let's keep on going. We're getting close to time. So another thing was important was we need to document our API, right? So how should we document it? So who needs to access this information will make it easier to know, what we should do. So developers in your team, they're developing the API. Maybe they're dog fooding it too, testing it, etc. They can probably just look at the API code, right? So they can look at the code. Is that self-documented? Do we have enough documentation in there? Is it understandable? Yeah, but maybe we can do better. What if they're front-end developers and they're not back-end? Maybe they're QA and they can just test it, but they can't actually, they can't actually get that code. They don't have access to it. They don't have permissions, so they can't see it. So we probably want to give them better documentation. And then developers that are consuming your API or services that consume your API, they can't see your API code. So then we have to figure out what format do we put it in? How do we keep it up to date? How user-friendly is it, right? So luckily, there's existing tools and formats out there. So Open API specification is one of them, and that's used to be known as Swagger. I think Open API version 3 is basically a Swagger, or Swagger version 3 is Open API specification. So everyone's been doing APIs, and everyone's fought about what's the best thing, this, that, and eventually have come to sort of a standard. So the Open API standard is great. They have YAML format, yuck, but they also have JSON formats, yay! And there's a bunch of tools out there. And so this tool here, swagger.editor.io, it's pretty neat. Like you can see your Swagger on one side and you can see the interface on the other. I'm going to jump out of this here and sort of show you here. So this is a Swagger editor. So you can basically dump your Swagger file in here and then you can click and look, like here's my get. But look at the questions one, display a paginated list of questions. I can see if I have any parameters. You can do different things in here. If I post to questions, you can see information as well. So, there's certain thing that's built in. Paste your Swagger in here, look at it in a tool. Pretty neat. But that's not all, right? So that JSON file or the Swagger file, that's a lot of junk, shall we say? Not very simple to look at. You're like, how the hell do I do that, right? Some companies actually do that first. So they document the entire API before they write any code. So some companies have the time, the foresight, the budget, and the specifications to completely generate their Swagger documentation manually by hand. They mock up the responses they're going to get. They figure out what the schema, what format the responses are going to be in. They're going to look at what inputs they're going to get. They review these, they revise them, and that's part of the whole API first. They'll go over with the key people in the company, the external entities, and when they're done, they actually have tools in a lot of languages that can generate all your code from that Swagger docs. And so they basically do all the documentation first in the Swagger doc, and then push a few buttons, run a command, and it generates all the code you ever need. So we've talked about this before at Audis about doing something like that, but we don't usually have the time, the foresight, the budget to do a whole app. And then what happens if you build another new section? Does it recreate all the pieces that you've already documented before? Is it smart enough just to do the piece that you just created? What if you change something? Is it smart enough to so basically, what we usually like to do is we like to iterate in the code after some planning like we're doing. But we've talked about these ideas, but it's not our normal workflow because really aren't too many people that can actually fully document their stuff before they write any code. Hopefully we can plan it enough to get a good start. But again, we have those issues, and there are tools that do it in other places, and then they copy paste stuff. So that's something we've been talking about, and we may do it, but not just yet. So, but when we're documenting our API, like I said, Audis loves looking at established best practices and stuff. And so we've built modules to make your life easier. So CB Swagger module helps you create Swagger.json formats really easily inside your code. And we're going to look at that. So you can install CB Swagger. And once you do that, you get a way to generate that, but also ways for it to find out about your app. And the ColdBox app, without doing anything, CB Swagger will actually read your routing file, look at some of your handlers, and actually generate a pretty good chunk of the Swagger doc without you doing anything else. But we also have a CB Swagger UI tool that puts a Swagger UI module in development. And if you install CB Swagger UI, just like you saw that route visualizer where Jason said the run it impressive, for the visualizer, the CB Swagger UI module, it reads your app, generates the Swagger using CB Swagger, and then displays it, and it has all the same type of things. And that's built in ColdFusion, a little module, and it runs right in your command box. You don't have to go copy and paste your Swagger into that other editor.swagger.io. It's just there for you right away. So the CB Swagger helps generate this code. So you'll see it has the open API version. It's got information that you can put in there, but then it has paths. So API v1, and then there's a get, and there's talks about say hello, and it talks about the responses and the description. And this can kind of be a little hairy, but we make it easier because right in your handler, inside your code itself, where you normally, if you're using Java docs for other things, you can basically have an API version of that. So right in the handler, you can just say, give it the description. This displays a paginated list of questions. My route is get to API v1 questions. The tags, questions. The tags allow you to group stuff together. So if you have questions in here, maybe you have security, you can actually use tags to group them. So when you're looking at your really big documentation, it makes it easy to find the piece you want. You can also pass in parameters. So if we, for questions, normally we're just going to get a list of questions, right? But what if we have a bank of questions that maybe have 500? Maybe we have categories. Maybe we want to search for keywords. Maybe we want to see the third page of 25 questions and not all 700 questions at once. So we can actually pass in parameters to this endpoint. And so we can document them here. And CB Swagger, has these conventions where you can basically say, okay, I'm going to put my parameters JSON file in this folder, and it will go read it and include it in the documentation. I can actually document responses. So I can document the default, which is a 200, and I can put that response here. I can also do 401 responses and 400s. And so when people look in documentation, they've got examples of what happens when they get a 401 because they're not authenticated, or a 403 if they're not authorized, or a 400 because there's a validation error, And so the documentation allows you to do that. And CB Swagger will read this metadata, these comments, and generate that Swagger for you. And then the Swagger UI, it's basically reading your /Swagger, so it automatically reads the site it's running in, but you can put any Swagger URL here and it'll go read that too. So if you want to read the development version or the production version, if you store your artifacts somewhere on your, have an artifact folder somewhere or on S3 or something, you can point to different Swagger files and display it. And so here, it gives you the title, and this is still the template title here, but you'll see it's got a tag for authentication, a tag for default. You can also do other things. And so if I escape, we'll go here and look at, this is the Swagger documentation that we generated. So if I look for questions, load this up a little bit. So here, if I questions, get, displays a paginated list of questions. The tag is questions. The description, the parameters, it's in the page. That's basically the page number, the current page requested, used for pagination. Max rows, the max rows per page, used for pagination. It's a string, the default is 25. So this data, we can also have a flag for, should we include the answers when we get a list of questions? So we can have a Boolean flag for that. The Boolean is there and the default is false. If I successfully get one, so I get a successful one here, I can see that it returns, a certain type of object. It has properties like an error, messages, pagination, and data. The data is an array, the array of items with object. So there's a descriptive format here, and you can see, the data might be here, a question, tabs or spaces, question ID 1. Question 2 is, Adobe CF9 or Raylo. So we have pagination, but this documentation is generated, and then we can open up the Swagger UI folder, so Swagger UI, and now we can look here. We got authentication, we got default, we got questions. So if I pull up questions here, I can come down and see the page. Look, if I click try it out, I can actually come in here and execute it. It's going to tell me the curl that it ran, the request, that URL that it made, And it's going to give me an error right now because I've got the wrong server. Because look, you can say production server, dev server. If you need authorization tokens, you can authorize. It's pretty neat how this works. I'm going to try and re-execute this here. And now you see this is my curl. It's using the right URL. And now you'll see it's saying invalid or missing credentials. This is a 401 error because I don't have my code set up properly. So let me come into my handlers questions. I'm going to take off the security real quick so I can try it without my security. I don't want to log in. I'm going to rerun it real quick just so we can actually see the questions. So now you see I've got a bunch of questions, tabs or spaces. What's your favorite IDE? GitHub or GitLab, CF Builder or home site. I've got pagination. So there's 5 total records. We're on page 1 of 1. 25 rows per page. So it shows the response. It shows this. But I can also look at schemas and everything too. So there's a lot of cool stuff that this does, and it's reading your code and it's reading everything else. So like here, this is an example, but here's the schema, which says, look, if you look in data, we get a packet, the data packet of the request, an array of question structs. There's a question ID and a question. That's the format, the description, all that built in. It's pretty dang nice. And so that's just, another thing. And again, you can generate that documentation and Swagger and then paste it somewhere else or put it in your own tool. We just try to make it easier for you to work with all this stuff. Okay, I know we're at time already, but I'm going to do a little bit more here. So testing our API. We talked about testing it, making sure it's consistent, making sure it's reliable and stable. So we should test our API. So true BDD TDD testing says behavior-driven testing. We should basically write our tests before we write our code. You've talked for an hour already about all this planning. We haven't written any damn code yet. What's going on? Now you want us to write tests first? Yeah, pretty much we can. And really, the big question people say, well, how do I know what to test if I haven't written the code yet? Well, if you've planned it properly, we kind of have an idea of what we want to test already, right? Anybody know what we could do? Our user stories. Our tests are already partially planned, right? Our user stories gathered information. And if you guys remember, this was one of our user stories. As an admin, I want to get a list of questions so that I can display a list of questions to manage. With the right key, when I select a certain criteria, I'll get a paginated list of questions. That's something we can test. If I, as an admin, provide information for the new question, I can create a new question. If I don't have the right information, if I give invalid information, my test could make sure that we get a 400 validation error. So these are things I should be testing, right? We've identified the edge cases. We've identified the possible user stories and happy endings and error endings. Here, I want to have an authorization error because the user shouldn't be able to add questions, right? These are things we identified. We should be testing this. We've already got a plan for it. And looking at this, I don't know if you guys have used Testbox before or Jasmine or anything else, but there is a format we're testing, describe something, it does this or does that. But Testbox has this other format, which looks like this. Scenario. We're going to post to API v1 questions. Given we authorize with the user permissions, when I provide fields for a new question, when I provide valid fields for a new question, then the API gives me an authorization error because only admins can add new questions. That format matches your user story. You can write tests based on your user stories. And you've already written most of it. You just have to write the test piece. But the structure, the formatting, and everything else, what you should test, that's already done. We've already decided it. We're part of our planning process, right? So now, again, using ColdBox, there's certain ways we can test APIs, and you can test using Jasmine and Jest, actually, because an API can be consumed from Jasmine, right? JavaScript can consume your API. And I've done presentations before where I told them 3 different ways to test your API in ColdFusion. I presented at CF Summit. But yes, you can test it with something like Jasmine for JavaScript side. You can test it with Testbox on the ColdFusion side. And then you can do it with Testbox for just the unit test piece of it too. And then you're like, wait a minute, what about a database? Well, during our user stories, right, we've sort of specified, some of the inputs and outputs. But if we document our API, And again, documenting it is sometimes hard, but we should have an idea of what the inputs and outputs might be. I usually like to be a little bit more iterative with this part. I don't go to try and specify every single thing right off the bat, but I use something like database migrations, because then I can iteratively create and destroy my database tables in my developer server. I can add a couple more fields, drop the table, run my migrations to create all the tables again, and then I can just keep doing that until I get exactly what I need. And so we've got a module for that. So here's what our design sort of look like. We have a question ID, we have the question, we have a created date and modified date, and we can use database migrations. There's a module in ForgeBox that allows you from command box to run migrations. It keeps track of which migrations have run. You can migrate up to run all your migrations. You can migrate down to get rid of your migrations. So in here, we have a query saying query execute, create table, questions. I've got a question ID is an unsigned integer, not null, auto increment. My question is varchar. I got a created date, modified date, and I got a primary key, which, whoops. Again, I got to fix that. Hold on. All right. So here, and then when I drop, when I'm going down, I can also drop the question. So I could do a query execute, drop table questions, or I can use the schema.drop. And the cool thing is with CB migrations, it uses quick and QB stuff. So we actually have schema available. So this here would work great for MySQL. It would not work on another database, right? So if I use QB and I say schema.create questions, and I'm going to pass in my table to my closure, I'm going to have table.increments, question ID to create the primary key, table.string for question, table.timestamp, created date, table.timestamp, modified date. Now, that's going to do it. And if I'm using MySQL, MS SQL, Postgres, even Oracle, I think, it's going to know how to create the database. So if I'm sharing this code between different people and different databases, it'll actually generate the SQL code for that database type, which is pretty cool. And then we have the database design for answers. Sorry. Let me fix this one as well. But look, so we looked at answers, so we can design that as well. We have a database design for answers. We can do another one for votes. And so we design our database based on our user stories, and maybe if we need to update it from there. But basically, we're done with planning. So now we can actually write some code. So that's sort of the process we go through for planning. That's the process we go for getting to the point where you can actually start coding. But there's a lot of work involved. But having all this information now, the next steps are easier, right? And so this is sort of the process to make a good API. Now, we talked about some of the tools and everything, but basically, obviously, this sort of session here, you don't have to use ColdBox. You could use any API tool, but there's a few things that ColdBox does better, I think. It makes it easier, solve some pain points. And so that's one of the big things there. But yeah, I think that's sort of a great endpoint. I'm already over time. I was hoping to do more code, so I'll have to do another one. So hopefully we won't be waiting 2 years for the next one. But anybody got any questions? Considering I have to present basically a Vue.js app on top of this API in a couple of weeks, I probably should get that next one done pretty quick. But so obviously I've done some code, and but I wanted to sort of walk through a lot of that stuff. So,
and even if you don't get the talk done before you give, if you don't get this talk done before you do the talk in a couple of weeks, the talk that would follow this could follow that, and you might have learned some things as you put together the talk that's coming up.
Yeah. So again, a lot more planning than I thought. But yeah, I wanted to make sure I didn't skimp over things, because a lot of times we sort of run through things. We assume people understand stuff, but I didn't even mention what REST is and talking about resources and verbs too much. But that's sort of some of the tools and thought processes, and a lot of that works together, right? I think the user stories that way. Once I realized, oh, that matches the user stories, now we can plan, And that makes our tests more readable for the user too. Like if we actually have to display something to a manager, they can see that we're testing those endpoints. We're testing those user stories. And if something's broken, we're like, well, do we have that user story? Do we have that, use case? Do we have the test for it? So I think it's, comes sort of full circle. And I think it's really important to make sure you have all the right foundation before you build the API.
Sure. I think it's been a great talk, and you've heard some good comments. I don't think there's any outstanding questions that you haven't addressed.
I've been trying to follow
have any
along
before
as
you
I
go? Sorry?
Yeah, I was saying, sorry, I try to follow along as I go and answer them.
Yeah,
so.
You did a great job in that regard. So does anybody have any that they feel have not been addressed or any they want to ask before we might call it quits? And while we're waiting for that, again, you're saying in just a couple weeks, you'll be giving...
Yep, at Adobe Developer Week. I should probably put that on the slide too.
Week, right. So I'm just saying, don't feel compelled to get this one done.
Yeah.
Before then, right? There's only one more date before then, so
I know I don't want to push it too far. So
yeah, you'll have that talk, and it'll cover what it covers, and then after that, you can think about whether there's a good follow-on to this.
Yeah, I mean, there really is. I mean, because basically, now that I've covered the theory behind all this, the next one can actually be doing it. We can actually look at, okay, here's my routes, here's my database migrations, and we can really go through that. But if we look at the agenda here, you'll see that Charlie's up first on the 18th. So more modern than most realize. And then Luis Mahano is going to be speaking about modern, functional, and fluent CFML REST APIs. And this is, based on, actually, me and him have done a couple of variations of this talk over time. And then, so there's a lot of cool stuff in there, which will play in. But yeah, building the apps with Vue.js and ColdFusion APIs. This is basically building on top of that API that we just planned, and we're going to be, I'll be building out obviously before this, and then we can come back in a few weeks time or whatever, and sort of go over that in more detail, actually building it. So we'll scaffold out an app using the ColdBox REST template. We'll add some routes, some maybe resourceful routes. We'll use some of the tools to generate some stuff, basically add in our database migrations. We can use maybe some quick models, and then we can use the API to talk to the database to get data out, put data in. We can look at CB security for using JWTs for securing things, just like in that code. I had the secured on here. That's all you need to say is like, you have to be logged in to do this. If I have secured equals, admin, now you have to have an admin permission to be able to do this. Like that's how easy permissions is for some of this stuff. So there's a lot of cool things that we use and do, and it doesn't take too much to get set up to do it. And the ColdBox REST API, it comes with a lot of great stuff. So yeah, but again, I didn't want to try and rush through and show everybody that, because I've done that before and it was, a whirlwind, so I want to take my time and show people, make sure they understand it. And the planning steps today, hopefully, is a great base for that. So,
and of course, for this talk at the Dev Week, you could point people to these previous sessions as leading up to it if they want some background. And then it would also take the pressure off you at that talk at the Dev Week. If as you finalize it, you realize, oh goodness, I'm never going to get all this in here. Well, you could say, well, sometime in the near future, I'll follow up with the CFMeetup talk. And that's cool. People would understand you can't do everything in one talk, and we'd be there ready to have you give it again.
Yep, so that's sort of my plan, because obviously it's a big, even something simple as this, it's like there's a lot of knowledge that people have built up over time to create it, to use it, implement it in Vue. I mean, like, what is Vue? Some people don't even know what Vue.js is, so there's a lot in it. So I appreciate the time to be able to come and do that, and hopefully people got a lot out of this one. And we'll have that Adobe Developer Week session, and then we'll go into the more details of how I built it, and and you'll see all the planning sort of take fold. So,
and that one, of course, will have a far larger audience. It will stand alone. You'll have to figure out what makes sense to cover and not cover, and then folks, you can look forward to him coming back and doing some more in a later talk here. So we all who are interested in this topic should go see his Dev Week talk, because it's going to be different than these.
Yep. And the cool thing is that Into the Box, we're actually going to play the Developer Feud game that we're building. So I want to have it at the Happy Box. We have a party after the first day, and we're going to try a little Developer Feud game. So maybe we'll have speakers versus attendees, or maybe artists versus a community or something, and basically have like a little fun game with a mariachi band in the background and use it. And so that's the goal. Is once this API is out there, I'm going to have people go and answer the questions, because these questions we're going to put in here, we're going to use the TerraTech survey. So the ColdFusion State of the Union survey is going to be populated. So we have a lot of questions and answers already, but other people can go vote. So, if you like a certain thing and you didn't vote in the survey, you can go vote in the API once we publish it, or one of the little apps once we publish it. And then that way, when we play, we're using your data, and I think that's part of the value of it. It makes it fun, is because, you may think tabs are better, but maybe everybody else voted spaces. So if you pick tabs, you're going to get a low score. But if you pick spaces, you might get a high score.
Fun and educational.
Yep.
What more could he ask for? All right, cool. Yep. Well, the folks who've been saying thank you. You guys are kind, and let's go ahead and wrap it up. We're at 20 minutes after the hour, and
thanks, Charlie.
We'll wish you well with the Dev Week talk, and look forward to hearing from you to do another one to follow that. And perhaps between now and then, on the 14th, I might have another print session, and I doubt we'll do one the week of the Dev Week. There'd be no point in doing that. And then if, whatever, there's one more slot before our 300th, and for the 300th, we'll do something that'll be more of a retrospective, and perhaps, looking ahead and talking about, more meta stuff about the meetup. What could we do different? What should we do anything different? So look forward to that in a couple of sessions.
Great.
Cool.
Thanks again.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. And thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you all later. Till again.